So the scripture reading today is from Matthew, the second chapter, verses 1 through 12, and this is the Living Bible translation. Jesus was born in the town of Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. At about that time, some astrologers from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in far-off eastern lands and have come to worship him." King Herod was deeply disturbed by their question, and all Jerusalem was filled with rumors. He called a meeting of the Jewish religious leaders. "Did the prophets tell us where the Messiah would be born?" he asked. "Yes, in Bethlehem," they said, "for this is what the prophet Micah wrote. O little town of Bethlehem, you are not just an unimportant Judean village, for a governor shall rise from you to rule my people Israel." Then Herod sent a private message to the astrologers, asking them to come to see him. At this meeting, he found out from them the exact time when they first saw the star. Then he told them, "Go to Bethlehem and search for the child, and when you find him, come back and tell me, so that I can go and worship him too." After this interview, the astrologers started out again, and look, the star appeared to them again, standing over Bethlehem. Their joy knew no bounds. Entering the house where the baby and Mary, his mother, were, they threw themselves down before him, worshiping. Then they opened their presents and gave him gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But when they returned to their own land, they didn't go through Jerusalem to report to Herod, for God had warned them in a dream to go home another way. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. There is a place in your worship guide where you can take notes, and I believe that God has a message for you today. And if you would want to take some notes and reflect on that during the week, you are welcome to do so. So the Magi story is scandalous and disrespectful. It is outrageous and offensive. And if you don't feel that way, it's because you are not a first century Jewish Christian. The original audience of Matthew would have been greatly insulted by this story. Why? Well, let's return to the story a little bit and see it through a different lens. So these magi, notice they are not kings, contrary to our hymnal theology, but these wise men are astrologers, right? So they're looking at the stars and the constellations, and they're trying to make some kind of meaning out of them. They're trying to interpret it. And one day, they see something totally out of the ordinary that shouldn't be there. There's a star that's like in the wrong place. And it's brighter than all the others. And some scholars believe that it was probably a supernova, a star that has exploded, and so it shines a lot brighter than any of its counterparts. The interpretation was that a king had been born, because whenever something important happens on earth, it's reflected in the stars. And as they would follow this light, it led them to the region of Judea where the Jewish people lived. The Magi weren't just astrologers. The word Magi in Persian, which is where they were probably from, means priest. These were Zoroastrian priests, or basically religious leaders from another faith tradition. And they were familiar with not just their own holy scriptures and theology and faith, but they were familiar with others as well, including the Hebrew scriptures. So they knew that the Jewish people were waiting for a king. Messiah literally means anointed king. So they're waiting for this king, and they put this star that's leading them toward Judea and the scriptures that means they're waiting for this king together and think, maybe this is the newborn king of the Jews. So they take what some believe might have been up to a 900-mile journey and bring expensive gifts in order to worship or pay homage, to pay their respects to a potential newborn king. But they weren't just astrologers and they weren't just priests. These magi were also scientists. They were like chemists. They would mix different elements together And when people saw explosions or smoke or one element dissolve into another, it looked to them kind of like magic. And that's where our word magic comes from, is magi, because they knew the sciences and how elements operated. So these guys are kind of unlike anyone that we have here in our society, because they were part scientists but part sorcerer. They were part astrologists but part fortune tellers. They were learned, educated men, but also magicians. And in their culture, they were revered. They were respected. These men were wise and powerful and educated. But outside of their culture, a lot of people saw them as superstitious, foolish, even evil. Maybe not unlike how some people view medicine men in indigenous societies today. And so here you have these magi that are the first people to pay their respects or to acknowledge this new birth in Bethlehem. So the original Jewish Christians would have thought, wait a minute, the first people to worship my Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, were these horoscope-reading, superstitious, pagan magicians. Not faithful Jews, not people who've devoted their lives to the temple or who were the Pharisees or the chief priests, but religious leaders from another faith tradition. I mean, can you imagine? What if it was a bunch of Buddhist monks that first recognized who Jesus was, or Islamic imams that came to worship or to pay their respects to the Christ child? It's scandalous. And it was offensive to those who first heard this story. And notice, it doesn't say they converted to Judaism. It doesn't say that they gave everything up and became a follower of this child. They made the journey, gave their gifts, and returned home. Matthew is the only gospel writer to tell this story. Why did he tell it? Why did he take 12 verses to lay out this story that he knew would be offensive to its original audience? We don't know for sure, but what is the story telling us? It's telling us that maybe all the divisions that the Jewish people had put up, or human beings put up, between us and them, the Jewish faith and all those other faiths, maybe that's an artificial division that Matthew was trying to help them understand. Maybe he was trying to show them that Jesus came not just for the Jewish people, but for all people, regardless of ethnicity or faith tradition or socioeconomic background. Maybe he was saying that God can choose and bless and use people from all different faith traditions, all different backgrounds. The Magi remind us that those who are considered the foreigner, the outcast, those who are considered different, might just be the ones that find themselves in Christ's presence. What Matthew says is a staggering statement, that God will not be confined to any one group of people or any one faith tradition. That God can work anywhere and everywhere through so many people, and might just use the most unlikely people to teach us about who Jesus is. Because God works, as Scripture says, in mysterious ways. That's part of the scandal of this story. How did God use these wise guys, as we like to say? Well, they came and they brought these expensive gifts, right? And And very shortly after, they have to make this trip. They have to flee their homeland and go to Egypt. How do you think they financed that? How do you think they paid to travel 300 miles or so to get to Egypt? Joseph wasn't working, and I'm sure they didn't have a whole lot of savings at the time. They hadn't anticipated this trip. How did they make it in Egypt? It was the gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh, which were all very expensive. And the ways in which God used these priests from another faith tradition to be a part of this salvation story that was taking place. Scandalous magi still exist today. People from one faith tradition that offer precious possessions of gifts, sometimes even their very lives, to stand by those of another faith in respect or those who might be in need. And one of the stories I came across in the Egyptian Revolution in 2011, a group of Muslim people were protesting and praying in the streets. And when they pray, of course, they're on their knees and they bow down, and they were very vulnerable in this high-tension time. And so a group of Christians gathered around them, holding hands to protect this group of Muslims who were praying during this Egyptian revolution. And it was just a couple years later when an Egyptian Christian church had been threatened with violence during their Mass, this Catholic church. And they said, if you go to Mass, then you may not come out of it. You know, we're threatening your lives. But they went to Mass anyway, and a group of Muslims came and gathered around the church and holded hands to make sure that these people could worship in peace and in safety, so that no harm would come to them. What would the world be like if there were a little more magi in the world? What if we treated each other more like that, looking out for one another, protecting one another, even maybe offering our own lives or security for others? More Hindus that treated Buddhists and Islam and Muslims and Christians. What if Christians treated people of all faith traditions like that? That's part of what the Magi are teaching us in this story. They show up and they offer gifts out of respect for another faith tradition and are used by God in that process. What if we were Magi? But that would not have been the only scandalous part of this story, because then we have the whole history of King Herod. Herod would have been about 70 years old when Jesus was born. He had been the rightful king of the Jews for 35 years. Herod wasn't born Jewish, but he converted to Judaism when in his youth. And so he was quite literally the king of the Jewish people in that region. And King Herod did a lot of good. He built infrastructure and towers and buildings and palaces, and he kept the peace between the Jewish people and Rome. But he also was a power-hungry, insecure megalomaniac. He would do anything to get power and keep power. How did he keep the peace? He kept it by slaughtering thousands of his own people. He would say in order to prevent the Romans from coming in and killing even more, but still. And he was so insecure that he even killed his own family members, his wife's uncle, her brothers. Eventually, he killed her, and he killed 3 of his sons who were in line for the throne. That's what fear will do for you. He would stop at nothing to keep power, even at the expense of the lives of his family members and children. So it doesn't really surprise us much when the Magi knock on the door and they say, hey, we've come to worship the baby who's going to be the king of the Jews. That Herod goes ballistic. I mean, he freaks out. So this child is threatening his power, even at age 70, even having been on the throne for 35 years. So he deals with it the only way he knows how, which he plans to annihilate this child. But first he has to figure out who this child is. And he uses the Magi as part of his plan. So he sends them off in the right direction, but he says, oh yeah, and by the way, on your way back, why don't you just stop by my place and let me know the child's first name, last name, birth date, parents' name, social security number, mother's maiden name, and address. Because, I want to pay my respects too. Of course, when the Magi did not obey, he was infuriated. And so he just decides to kill every child in Bethlehem under the age of 2, which at that time may have only been a dozen or 2 dozen kids. But still, that's a dozen or 2 dozen families who've had their children ripped from their arms and slaughtered in front of them. And why? All because he was paranoid. He was fearful that he would lose his power. Fear makes us do things that we are not proud of. When we're afraid of other people, it leads us to say things and do things that are just antithetical to even how we would normally treat people, antithetical to our faith and what we believe. So for all you Star Wars fans, you may remember Yoda was counseling young Anakin Skywalker. And Yoda says to Anakin, fear is the path to the dark side. Because fear leads to anger. And anger leads to hatred. And hatred leads to suffering. And I sense much fear in you. Anakin does eventually go over to the dark side and one of the leaders as Darth Vader. I hope I didn't spoil anything for anyone. Sorry if I did. Fear. Fear leads to anger, hatred, and suffering. Have you ever been afraid of people that you never even met before? Has that fear ever led you to say or do things that you're not proud of? Fear leads to bigotry. Fear leads to racism. Fear leads to doing and saying things about someone else that we've never even met before. After 9/11, how many people who wore turbans were beaten or killed out of fear? How many citizens or police officers out of fear have used racial profiling in order to hurt an innocent person? How many people of Japanese descent were incarcerated or discriminated against during World War II out of fear? Fear leads us to do things we are not proud of, and it controls our lives. Herod was fearful, and his politics based on secrecy and terror and manipulation, well, they're still mimicked today. Human nature is human nature, isn't it? We still have Herods today. Whether it was Hitler, who was slaughtering and killing millions and millions of people, or even just recently in this decade, Kim Jong-un from North Korea killed his uncle and his half-brother because he was afraid that they were going to overthrow him. We still live in Herod-like times. But I think it's too easy to make the Herods of this world those political figures way over there in other countries. Because if we're honest, there's a little bit of Herod in all of us. There's a little bit of part of us that loves to have power and control, that doesn't like to be told no. And when we have that power, we want to use it to benefit ourselves. We want to use it to get what we want, and we don't like to be told no. And when we are, well, that power can be used to fire someone from their job, or demote them, or bully them, or demoralize them. We can influence other people, ruin someone's reputation, all because of our own fear and insecurity, when we are given just a little bit of that power that we long for. Fear leads to anger, to hatred, and then suffering. We see that in this world, and we might even see a glimpse of it in our own lives. But of course we want to hold on to power, right? I mean, who wants to give up their comforts and their privilege? No one would, not unless you follow a king that did the same thing. You know, the Herod-type leaders and people, they proved true what Martin Luther King Jr. once said, which is, history is the long and tragic story of the fact that the privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily, except for Jesus. Philippians tells us that Jesus gave up his power voluntarily. This divine power where he lived with God for eternity, he lived in equality with God, and yet he emptied himself. He made himself vulnerable. He took the form of a human being. That's the kind of king we follow. One who came, not found in the palaces of Herod, in the earthly power systems and privilege and structure that we would expect to find kings, but we found a king swaddled in the needs of the neglected, the rejected, and the disrespected. That's who we worship. That's Jesus who was born in Bethlehem. And Mary sang about this disruption of power, this unlikely king, when she said in her pregnancy that he's brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly, and filled the hungry with good things, and sent the rich away empty. God in Jesus Christ came to disrupt those power structures in our world and show us what true greatness is. And Jesus himself, when he was proclaiming to his hometown, quoting Isaiah about what his mission and purpose was about, he said, I've been anointed to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And the people that heard this sermon were so outraged, they tried to throw him off a cliff. That's what happens when you come and disrupt the powerful. That's what happens when you follow Jesus. Herod tried to kill him and did not succeed. His hometown people tried to kill him. But eventually the Pharisees and Sadducees, the religious leaders of that day, with a little help from Rome, succeeded. And that's the king that we follow. So the Magi teach us that we have a choice today and every day. Which king do you follow? Do you follow the Herods of this world and the Herod within yourself? Have this stranglehold on power and comfort and privilege and wealth, and yet live in fear and insecurity? Or do we follow a king who emptied himself, who came to love and sacrifice and show us how to live? Like the Magi, we have a choice. which king do you follow? We might kneel at the feet of Jesus, offer our gifts and ourselves. Like the Magi, we might come and respect another faith tradition and honor those who are a part of it. God is at work in this world in so many ways. We call the Magi wise men, and they were, because they chose to follow Jesus instead of Herod. Who will you choose, and how will you live accordingly? Wise ones still seek him.